The American Teilhard Association podcast features conversations and interviews which explore the life, thought, and vision of mystic scientist Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. We express our gratitude to Dalesford Abbey in Paoli, Pennsylvania, for allowing us to use their space and equipment in making this episode possible. Dr. Ernie Tamminga is a trained spiritual director and holds a PhD in cross-cultural religious studies from the University of California, Santa Barbara. During the 70s, he was a member of the board of the Phenomenon of Man project, which offered presentations and retreats centered on Teilhard's vision. Ernie has had a career in the technology industry and has taught university-level courses in world religions and in computer science. He is currently a board member of the American Teilhard Association and has recently presented for the Cobb Institute. At some point during our conversation today, Ernie and I begin to discuss art, at which point I reference a painting by Dali. I incorrectly in our conversation refer to the title of this painting as the Omega Point. I have featured a picture of the painting in the video version of this podcast if you're viewing it, and the correct title of this painting is The Ecumenical Council. So without any further ado, we hope you enjoy this episode of the American Teilhard Association podcast. Welcome everyone to the American Teilhard Association podcast. Today we are so fortunate to have with us Dr. Ernie Tamminga. Ernie, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Dr. Ernie has been a longtime Teilhardian. He has been in this world for quite some time, and he has a lot of experience, especially in sharing Teilhard's vision, teaching it to people. And we're just really grateful that he can be with us today on the podcast. So to start off, Ernie, when and where did you meet Teilhard de Chardin?
A long time ago. I believe it was in the mid-60s. An old friend, already an old friend by that time, a lifelong friend now, Ben Lazardi, whom I have known since third grade together. When I moved to Los Angeles in the mid-60s, he was already living in that area. We got together, and he told me he was a member of this group, the Phenomenon of Man project, it was called, and they had put together a presentation about the thought of this person I had never heard of before, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. So I went to one of their presentations. The early version of the presentation was really long. If it was given on a Saturday, it was all day. The artists in the group had developed over 600 color slides. And I experienced that. And I had been brought up Catholic, but had kind of lapsed. And in Los Angeles, I was kind of spiritually lonely. So when I experienced that presentation, many aspects about it felt kind of like coming home. And I joined the Phenomenon of Man project not long after that, and was a member of the presentation team for about 10 years.
That's phenomenal. I'm curious to learn more about the project, but what was your learning curve like in terms of your introduction to Teilhard and then getting yourself involved in this project? Was it pretty steep?
Not too bad, actually, because this presentation that they had already developed, and the really masterful color slides that they had developed to illustrate even some of the complicated points, was so well done that I felt like I understood it almost on first viewing. It was a day-long viewing, but I did not feel at all bewildered by it. So I started reading Teilhard on my own almost immediately after, and I became the newsletter editor for the project. I did that for several years and was doing, I guess I would call it Teilhardian writing of my own in that context.
Very nice. So this project, the Phenomenon of Man project, was already in the works when you encountered it. And I have found myself with Teilhard in that as heady as his concepts can be and as verbose as his writing is at times, there is something intuitive about his work and his vision where you don't necessarily need to get it all, like all of the nuts and bolts of noosphere and complexity consciousness, omega and all that, to kind of have a sense of what he's talking about. And as someone who's fond of Carl Jung, Jung talks a lot about this click dynamic where, if you're trying to interpret a dream, you'll just find that something kind of clicks in terms of its meaning or the interpretation. And I personally experienced something similar with Teilhard's work. And that seems to be quite common with a lot of people who are drawn to his work. They don't really grasp the fullness of it, but they get it. It makes sense. It resonates with their being.
I think so. And that particular book, what used to be called The Phenomenon of Man, now The Human Phenomenon,
Mhm.
is probably the most challenging intellectually, because he claims that he says he's writing as a scientist
Right.
in that book. And there's a lot of detail in the book, so it can be challenging to make one's way through, but especially with the help of all those color slides that the guys in the project had already developed. It made my entry into it very, very smooth. And I probably resonated also from my Catholic upbringing with some of Teilhard's view of universal Christ and things like that. Although the universal Christ was not part of my Catholic upbringing, come to think of it.
Were you raised with the Baltimore Catechism, Ernie?
I was. I
Okay.
memorized the whole thing. I don't have it memorized anymore, except who made me? God made me. Why did God make me? That's about as far as I could get into it now.
Right. Probably for the better.
Yeah, I think so.
We have a new Teilhardian type catechism to put in there, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what was the reception like when you first came into contact with your friend who was studying Teilhard and the Human Phenomenon Project, or the Phenomenon of Man Project, as it was called at the time? What was the, beyond Teilhard resonating with you and, maybe the other people who were presenting this project, what was the audience's reception to his thought like at this point in history?
There was a lot of excitement in the 60s, early 70s. As you know, when Teilhard, before he died, he researched canon law. He had been prohibited to publish his spiritual works during his lifetime.
Mhm.
So instead of, he found in canon law that he did not have to will his works to the church. So he willed them to Jean Mortier, his secretary, who legend has it kind of started publishing the minute he died. And the timing, from a cultural perspective, the timing was good. He died in 1955, and that was kind of the run-up to that era that we call the 60s now, where there was so much ferment in terms of consciousness
Mm.
and exploration of new worlds, things like that. The dawning of the age of Aquarius, that was that moment. So the audiences that we encountered, I'm not sure because of what, except that it was part of that general ferment. All of us in the project had day jobs, excuse me. So we would present at night times, or on weekends. We would, fly around to a few cities and present in schools and churches. And in general, the reception was quite exciting and excited.
Mhm.
I always remember that especially excited seemed to be communities of nuns back in the day. I mentioned
Yeah.
that to Kathleen, who is a nun herself, and she acknowledged that fully, said found that too. Um, so in general, really receptive audiences, mixed receptions in some specific audiences, of course.
Mhm.
In general, it felt like it was a component of the overall excitement that was going on at the time in terms of some change of consciousness.
Yeah, I'm always interested on the time period and how Teilhard's work was received, and especially I'm thinking like the civil rights movement was happening at that time, and his thought certainly lends itself to a more inclusive theology and more expansive theology. His affirmation of the human person, the importance of the human person. We're not the center of the universe, but we play a very pivotal role within this whole thing. And yes, I've noticed too myself and just, anecdotal, excuse me, encounters with people, there really seems to be a fondness for him within the women religious, particularly those that were of the generation where they were in formation at that time. And there's just something implicit within our soul, within our psyche, that longs for this type of thinking. I mean, there's that quote from Teilhard where he says there's an almost sensual longing we have for those that have a similar, larger vision of the world. And I just think that that is so true, and it resonates so strongly with me and with all the other people like yourself, Teilhardians, that find ourselves being attracted to one another. And I'm just reflecting here in the moment, thinking that his resonance with women religious in particular is profound. And I'm wondering if that's just because he had such a keen sense of the feminine in his own life, working through the spirit of the earth and the energies that we encounter, and especially the way that he was quite verbal, and he didn't speak it, but it was written about his criticisms of the church and what it needed to do and how important women were within that and the feminine. So yeah, I mean that's certainly a dynamic that I've noticed too when I've met people that were in formation during the 60s and 70s.
I think so, all that you just said. And this was also, well, the feminist movement was going on. That was part of that general um, upheaval, almost upheaval, up,
Right.
upheaval of consciousness. And the this feminine spirit of the earth, um, which was very much near the core of Teilhard, I think, as you said, resonated especially with a lot of women religious.
Yeah. Ernie, I'm gonna go off script for 1 second here. I have a book. Actually, I've not read it. It was handed to me by one of the Norbertines that I work with here. It's called America's Teilhard, Christ and Hope in the 1960s by Susan Cassman Sack. Are you familiar with that at all?
No, is that recent?
I think it came out within the last 5 years or so. And like I said, I've not had a chance to crack it open yet. But I believe that Kathleen Duffy is familiar with it as well. But just our conversation here is making me think like, isn't there a text I have? And here it is sitting on the top of my stack. So you may be
America's
interested,
Teilhard.
but something I've got to get into myself.
I'll look that up. Thank you.
And our viewers might be interested too. So hopefully it is it's good for someone out there. Yeah.
Good. Okay.
So yeah, to get back on track here, you said you were presenting this project, Human Phenomena, or the Phenomenon of Man project rather, at schools and churches. Now the audience, like at schools, were they students? Were they high school students? Were they faculty? And like same for the churches. What type of demographic were you working with?
Mainly, I think all that you just enumerated there, students and faculty. I
Okay.
remember being at, I don't recall now clearly if I'm thinking of Berkeley, but one of the universities in the Bay Area, um, at the Newman Foundation. I think it was they who sponsored our presentation one day. For some reason, I always remember, and we handed out questionnaires every time and then asked for audience response. And probably inevitably would tend to remember the negative ones. So I remember somebody in the, I think it was the Berkeley audience, it was a woman who responded, just what you'd expect from Los Angeles, a lot of pretty pictures with no substance. We didn't get many reactions like that, though.
Yeah, it's always interesting how it doesn't resonate with people, what they take from it. Yeah. Um, I guess you were kind of in the epicenter of that movement too, in a way. I mean, you weren't exactly in Haight-Ashbury, but still, you're in LA, you're in California, West Coast. It's just known as always being so progressive, and you're appropriately being able to share with an audience that there seems to be a good reception with. So, yeah, I'm just curious about how that went because as someone that has young children myself, I try and teach a little bit of Teilhard and stuff with them, and I'm just more curious as to how the ATA or to how just Teilhard's writing and vision in general can reach a younger audience. I know there's been a little bit of stuff done with that, but it's something that I feel is a very important avenue for us to explore as we go into the future here.
That's an important question and not an easy one to answer, I think.
Um,
As the young generation these days is not the same as the young generation in my day. Um, Good question. Um, a lot of, I think the slides that I somehow inherited when the Phenomenon of Man project stopped existing. I have all of those color slides and I've digitized a whole bunch of them. So I'm using those in my own presentations these days. And judging from the reactions to some recent presentation I've given with those, the artwork goes a long way to make him accessible. Probably wouldn't necessarily appeal to children, but possibly young people. And of course, depending on the overall presentation that they're embedded in. But the artwork, I think, is still valuable. I've gotten a lot of comments from people about how helpful those illustrations are in trying to understand, especially something like a book like The Human Phenomenon, which is pretty thick intellectually.
That's putting it mildly, yeah. And I guess that is a challenge of transposing Teilhard's thought into artwork, especially relevant artwork, depending on your demographic of who the audience is, because sometimes that can be a gift to be able to take such complexity of thought and to be able to express it in a new way that is maybe more digestible by people, more relatable. But sometimes it's just so challenging to take such a complex thought and put it into a simple form. I know a number of artists, fine artists, have been inspired by Teilhard's work. So the proof is in the pudding kind of there in terms of his influence. I think there's a Dali painting by him, is it? Or not by him. There's a Dali called the Omega Point, I believe.
I don't know.
And I think there's also, oh geez, well, I might have to edit that out. But at any rate, I know there's a couple fine artists that have been influenced by Teilhard. So,
yeah. And the particular artwork in the project, of course, was both inspired by Teilhard in terms of the art, but it was also intended to help clarify his ideas. So it was ideas and artwork deliberately in one, not only, not to denigrate that, but not only art inspired by Teilhard.
Good. Yeah, because that's important for the visual people out there like myself. Having an image sometimes really helps to make that, to make it more whole. So in part of your Teilhardian training, we can call it, you had the privilege to work with Raymond Panikar. And I know he is a very influential teacher when it comes to that lineage of Teilhardian thought. I always think of him when I read or think of the term the cosmotheandric being of Christ, in terms of this third dimension of Christ that Teilhard highlights, where Christ is not just seen within the typical hypostatic union of being human and divine, but being human, divine, and cosmic as well, filling out every nook and cranny, known and unknown within the cosmos. Therein is that sustaining presence of Christ. So what was that like in working with him? And maybe if you want to share any anecdotes.
Right. I never met Teilhard in the flesh. I spent 5 years though with Panikar in his graduate seminar. He called it Cross-Cultural Religious Anthropology was the name of the seminar here at UC Santa Barbara. I still live in this area. We used to argue in the seminar often. This was the feminist movement time too. We used to argue about that phrase, the cosmotheandric reality, because andros is specifically male.
Sure.
So we insisted that it should be theanthropocosmic, even though we realized that was a much more clumsy, sayable way of putting it. We never resolved the argument. Panikar would occasionally use theanthropocosmic in some of his own writings, but he wanted to insist on the simpler to say cosmotheandric.
Sure.
The root of the phrase, of course, is the Trinitarian insight. And Panikar, was all about what he would call the Trinitarian insight, or sometimes the Advaitic insight, essentially non-dual. He was one of the 20th century's most important, I think, even if not as widely known as I think it should have been. One of the 20th century's most important thinkers in terms of deep dialogue across boundaries. And inevitably, when I, but I think anyone tries to take Teilhard seriously and imagine what an awakening noosphere might be like, right away you have to start thinking in terms of the relationship and communion between people. And Panikar's work, Panikar's life, was totally dedicated to that kind of in-depth dialogue across boundaries. He used to distinguish between what he called dialectical dialogue and dialogical dialogue. Dialectical dialogue is when you have a more or less intellectual conversation and you're trying to convince each other of your ideas. That's a dialectical dialogue. Dialogical dialogue is when you're in deep communion with the person that you're dialoguing with. There's a short video on YouTube by Ramon Panikar called "The Window," which I highly recommend. He explains there what he means by dialogical dialogue, and he says the metaphor he uses is a window. I look through my window, and if the window is clean, I don't even realize it's a window. And I don't realize it's a window until I encounter somebody else looking through their window, and they don't see the same thing I see. And that's an opportunity for letting both of our worlds get much bigger. Panikar often, he also had his own definition of the word myth, which he referred to as the realm of the self-evident. Our myth is something that's so deep in us that we don't even realize that it's the story we live by, so to speak. And as soon as we become aware of our own myth, we're already in another one. And infinite regress if you keep doing that. So in the Teilhard movement in general, now as well, and in any movement having to do with change of consciousness and planetary crisis and all that, we hear very, very often what we need is a new story. That's certainly true. The deep challenge is you cannot just whoop up a new story. You can sit down and create one, but it has to dawn on you.
Yeah.
In you. It has to become the realm of the self-evident for you. That's a critique I have, and I remember Panikar used to have too, of what we now call cultural appropriation. I don't think we had invented that phrase yet back then. And when people say the Western consciousness, we need to learn from indigenous cultures and appropriate that kind of spirituality in our own. And Panikar was quite critical of such a stance, very much in favor of learning from whomever we can learn from, especially people who are different from our own selves. But that approach too easily falls into a very developmental approach. You know, the slogan of the integral movement, for example, is transcend and include. But too often, that kind of imagining tends to privilege what we already are. And we'll look around for something below us, so to speak, and include it in what we are. But the what we are is assumed to be the main vehicle for going forward. And that's because it's our myth. It's the realm of the self-evident for us. And Panikar said over and over again that if you try to do a description of somebody's culture or religion, and if somebody in that culture does not recognize him or herself in it, you've got it wrong. It's as simple as that. So you can't just pick out the things you like and then say we're going to incorporate those into the story that we already have. It can't work that way.
Yeah, you mentioned the word myth, and I think of how when I am in dialogue with people sometimes, dialogue, not dialectic, right? But no, when you're talking with people and you bring up that term myth in relation to religion, even in, say, the Christian sense, in relation to the person of Jesus, the myth of Jesus. It's like, what do you mean? Jesus is a real person. Yes, I know, I'm not arguing that. However, there is a truth deeper than that person of Jesus of Nazareth that is expressed through his story, right? And Teilhard has this very unique way of being able to explain this myth and with such a dynamism that he has this merger of religion and science in a way, right? Um, and now it seems like you brought up the word the integral or the idea of the integral movement. It just seems so important that in going forward, um, it's an integrated effort because I'm thinking of how you were sharing your experiences early on with Teilhard during the time of civil rights, the feminist movement. There's kind of this sway towards a liberalism, right? Progressivism. And that pendulum tends to go back and forth within our culture, especially within Western culture. And now, and even in terms of talking about women religious before, right? That was still seen as a more progressive type thing. And now you have within our culture, particularly within like Christianity or Catholicism, which is where that's the faith that I practice and what I'm most exposed to. There seems to be a movement toward, and it's not, I don't really know anyone within this, and I can't say it's just something I read articles about, and you might meet someone from time to time, but it's nothing I've had the chance to dialogue with someone deeply about. Um, this movement back towards a more traditionalism, conservatism with the faith. And of course, that gets reflected and is reflected by different political dynamics in the country and stuff like that. But just in terms of a spiritual practice, in terms of religion, to kind of keep it in a vacuum, although we shouldn't, it's just a dynamic that I've noticed and how it's not productive for moving forward. You just get this oscillation back and forth. And I think this is kind of what you're talking about in terms of really needing to integrate this thing as an organic whole in order to move forward and not be picky and choosy about what we're trying to incorporate. Is that in line with what you're saying? Ernie, you're muted.
There. Yes. Also in line with what Anakar often said. Um, I may have already quoted him saying that I'm holding out for a mutation.
No.
It's kind of if somebody would ask him about the human future, um, that was his usual response. You know, it came out sounding like maybe like a joke, but it was not.
Mm-hmm.
Holding out for a mutation. And Honecker himself, his mother was a Spanish Catholic, and his father was a Hindu holy man. So he was born into that quest for
Yeah.
love across boundaries. He himself was a Catholic priest, a Hindu holy man, a Buddhist, many other things. And it's really easy to call yourself all those things, but to be recognized as such is something else. Again, um, so in an interview that's also available on YouTube, he tells the interviewer, not jokingly, that the task before us now is to integrate 6,000 years of human history, and not just our history, but not just the story that leads right up to us, but human history in general,
Yeah.
across time and across um, cultural barriers.
Yeah.
That's the kind of mutation that he said he's holding out for, said he was holding out for. And it's the kind of, when I try to imagine the awakening of noosphere, um, I can't put it any better way than that. We need to truly integrate 6,000 years at least of human history across all boundaries. And that would be an awakening.
Yeah, and that for me it awakens this Jungian sense. Well, first of all, we have to go back to the word myth, right? And whenever I hear the word myth, I think of Joseph Campbell. He's just so implicit within the study of mythology, right? And how we have understood that, especially in the West. And part of that Campbellian journey, into the unknown, especially, very much mirrors the Jungian process of individuation and how we have to go into our unconscious to discover these unconscious parts of ourself and bring them to awareness in order to be integrated as a person, right? And a critical component and a difficult component of that Jungian process is the shadow, those elements of ourself that we would rather not put forth when we enter a room for the first time, the part of ourself that gets angry or is controlling, right? These less desirable aspects of our character, which are nonetheless still part of who we are, but we tend to suppress them in different ways as opposed to embrace them and integrate them in ways that might be more healthy, right? So I'm just thinking of how, maybe that mutation in some way is a inward journey going into the shadow in a way, where it seems like now we're so quick to project those elements within us that may still be unreconciled regarding difference with people, or whatever issue is insert here. They're getting projected on such a mass scale now onto different figures, be they political figures or cultural figures, entertainers, whoever they may be. And it's creating a very, I don't know, a divisive dynamic where it's us and them, and it's not, what do I need to do within myself first to make myself a better person, to then be able to have an impact on the community, to improve the community, to be able to have an impact on the world, right? And how personal myth is so critical on how our exploration of our own personal myth is so important. But the point I really want to get to here is how ultimately, and I think this is what I'm getting from your explanation of Panikar and how he was influenced by Teilhard, is that we really can't separate, once we get down to it, like you just said, you keep going back, we can't separate our personal myth from the story and the myth of the planet Earth. And we can't separate that from the story of cosmogenesis, right? So I can only just, and I'm just kind of speculating here, but just think that so much of us as like a collective humanity, getting more in touch with our shadow, more in touch with that part of ourself that we need to learn to love more, to embrace more, to transform, is something with going into nature, something with being more consciously connected to the natural world. And I'm using this to segue into some of the more recent work that you've done in terms of the recent programs that you've done, particularly with the Cobb Institute, where you're talking about how the noosphere is not the internet, and how our over-reliance and our infatuation with technology is leading us into some murky waters here. And I'm just curious, Ernie, after my long spiel there, if you would be so kind as to just share a little bit about the work that you're currently doing with that, and any thoughts that you might have that would be relevant to share.
Right. Jeremy Lent, in his fairly recent book, The Web of Meaning, references Teilhard and talks about how Teilhard's vision ultimately includes all humans and all life on Earth. And then Jeremy Lent criticizes what he considers some technocentric aspects of the Teilhard community, as in Lent's view, they kind of jettison the rest of life on Earth except for us. Like in Teilhard's Convergence, you can read that, and sometimes Teilhard comes off this way. You can read that as leading up to us and kind of having used up everything, quote, below it, unquote. It's possible to find in Teilhard passages that go either way, where he's really longing for and expressing a communion of consciousness in the planet. You can also find passages easily enough where he's almost embracing that one, like the what's behind us is used up. I think in The Future of Man, also in the human phenomenon, he uses phrases like, We are separated from the animal by our consciousness, reflective consciousness, separates us from the animals, he says, by a chasm which the animals cannot cross. That's pretty stark.
Uh-huh.
I don't think that's correct. I think it's not a chasm with us on one side and animals on the other. I think it's a different neighborhood of consciousness. And so we should meet our neighbors and respect our neighbors. I like to think, and I do think, that had Teilhard been allowed to publish and engage communities, he might have ameliorated some of his own thought in this regard if he were challenged on things like this. He wanted universality. And he was very French, brought up in the tradition of Descartes, so forth, very dualistic. He avowedly refuses dualism and wants an evolutionary monism instead. But it's still too easy to read this evolutionary monism as a force field, something that uses up all the rest of energy as it goes, like using all the rest of energy as a fuel for itself instead of incorporating it in love. And love is so deep in Teilhard. So I often get surprised when it feels to me like he's dismissing other life forms out of hand.
Uh-huh.
As you probably, I'm sure you already know, in the fundamental energy of the universe, he distinguishes two aspects, which he calls tangential energy and radial energy. And they're not two, though. They're two aspects of the same energy. Tangential energy is the physical energies that bring elements together on the same level of complexity, like gravity is a tangential energy. Radial energy, he says, is the internal tendency to unite and transform. And the inner energy, radial energy, is as fundamentally real as the tangential, at least as fundamentally real. And he eventually identifies in human phenomenon, he identifies radial energy with love.
Mhm.
It's not just a sentimental idea for him, it's the fundamental energy of the universe. And especially given that, I think we should not disavow our relationships with all the beings that are not us. And that's my critique also of what I call technolatry. I didn't make up that word. I thought I did, but I didn't. The idolization of technology.
Mhm.
And I'm personally put off by visions that talk about we becoming cyborgs, having computers inserted into our brains and us inserted into computers.
Uh-huh.
It strikes me as cool, maybe,
Uh-huh.
but it doesn't strike me as a transformation, evolutionary transformation of consciousness. That technology, internet, AI, all of these are really, really powerful and dangerous tools for the kind of consciousness we already have. They are not a transformation of consciousness that Teilhard was hoping for, and the mutation that Panakar was holding out for.
Yeah, I think that's one of the more challenging um, aspects of Teilhard's vision is working with what is not present yet, and what very few people have a real cognitive grasp on how it works now. I know that field is greatly expanding in terms of artificial intelligence, quantum computing, nanotechnology, all of these great advances that lead us in this direction of becoming cyborgs. But for me, there seems to be this is a term I've heard within the past few years, a great spiritual bypass, if you will, in using those things, because it's kind of like, let me upload my consciousness into a quantum computer or whatever it is, so that I don't have to go through the suffering of decay and death and right all of these parts that are quite implicit within not just our natural world, but within this meta process of transformation. It's something that we see Jesus himself have to go through. And it's something we've just seen repeated on a fractal level throughout nature. So why shouldn't we have to go through it in a way that is not so dissociative, maybe is the word I'm looking for. There's a separateness, right? Like you're talking about how radial energy and tangential energy are two sides of the same coin, essentially, in the same way that he sees spirit and matter as two essences of the same stuff, he says. And yeah, it seems like that moment in which we have uploaded consciousness into the silicon chip or something like that, then there has been a breach of that union, a breach of that that non-dualism in a way. Does that make sense?
In the presentation I did for the Cobb Institute the other day, when we got to that topic of cyborgism and uploading into a machine only our consciousness, I asked folks to reflect in the moment. When you're listening to this presentation, or when you're sitting here doing whatever you're doing while this presentation is going on, feel the way that your body is interacting with what you're sitting on. Feel that. Feel the temperature of the air. Notice any sounds around you. Are birds singing? Any other sounds around you? Do you really want to give all that up and be only consciousness uploaded into a machine? I think except if you're tangent here, I can totally understand, like if someone has lost control of their own body and are intrigued by the possibility of having some kind of implant that would let them control their movements with their mind.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
If we are not in that state, and if we have bodies that are experiencing sensations all around us, temperature, sound, all of that,
Mm-hmm.
I personally cannot imagine wanting to give all that up in favor of being just a consciousness in a machine.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm thinking too, this is a point that I've made before, how so much of this technology too, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, nanotechnology, so much of this is driven and funded by our military or Department of Defense, right? So that being the platform from which it is arising starts to indicate a lot of what its intention is in that way, right? Not to say that we can't use these things in other ways. Like I was very hesitant to get involved with AI and stuff really until the past year. I found some really pretty cool AI programs, and I've been using them for Teilhard stuff to produce video content and stuff like that. ChatGPT is great for working through large documents and isolating some information and stuff. You start to see the limitations of these things the more you interface with them too, and you get a sense of how they work and whatnot. But you start to see the potential too. And yeah, that's just where I'm at with that is like, well, at first I was kind of like, oh, I don't know about this, right? And then it's like, well, not, and then it's like, I don't know about it because look where it's coming from.
Yeah.
How much innovation has been driven by warfare and conflict, right? A lot of our innovation, arguably, the space race, right? It's not all a bad thing. And I think that's a core element of Teilhard too. It's a matter of how you look at these things, right?
I shared in presentation the other day some of his reflections on the atomic bomb.
Mm.
And you can feel in that one already this temptation toward technology. I think it's not put the same in the recent edition of the Human Phenomenon, but I think he used to be quoted as saying, when, not on the Human Phenomenon, but in another essay, that when that blast went off on Bikini, all of humanity took a step forward And I remember when I first read that, it occurred to me, well, what about the people who used to live
Hmm.
in Bikini? Was that a step forward for them? Um, so too easy to get really enthralled with the possibility of evolution and then conflate it with technological development, and they're not the same thing.
Right.
I asked AI, by the way, I was trying to find a particular um, passage in Teilhard that I've been unable to find. I remember I really loved it. I think it was during wartime, but unfortunately, it's not in Writings in Time of War where I looked. He's describing a scene in a village, a small village, I think somewhere, I believe it was in France. And there was a moment of peace, and the people in this village were celebrating. And he said there was a sense that it was a shared consciousness. They were
Mhm.
all the same consciousness. And I really wanted to cite that in my presentation, but I couldn't find it. So I asked ChatGPT, and ChatGPT seemed to recognize the passage. And then it said, if you want to know exactly where it came from, and it gave me a reference, and it wasn't there.
Yeah.
This is an instance of AI hallucinating, the way they put it. Um, so I'm on technology a lot. I spend a good deal of my life on screens like this. So I'm not anti-technology by any means. I wouldn't be alive without technology. I had open heart surgery and it breathed for me, for that time.
Mhm.
But technology vis-a-vis technolatry, I think
Mhm.
that's the distinction to maintain or try to get back to. I've heard a few presentations where really thoughtful presentations about the possibility of AI becoming self-aware.
Mhm.
I kind of don't think so, um, but I can't rule it out. I mean, some people who do very, very thoughtful presentations are at least open to the possibility, not really predicting it, but open to the possibility. Um, Recent book by Anil, A-N-I-L, Seth, S-E-T-H, in a conversation on the Templeton podcast. He's talking about the question in that regard, whether AI can become self-aware. The question comes down to whether consciousness is based on computation or on life. And he's convinced self-awareness is based on life. And AI is based on computation. It's not just computation, but it's based on that. And so Seth, anyway, is convinced that machines as such cannot become self-aware.
Mhm.
Well, there are writers who predict that they will, so I don't know by any means.
Yeah, there's a lot of speculation there. And like I said, a lot of fear people have, but a lot of potential too. And, I've heard people make the comparison before when new technology came out, people were afraid of it. And now it's a different layer of technology, a different level because it has a higher form of complexity. Therefore, it has a higher form of consciousness to it. And all I have to take from that is that it probably is calling us to a higher degree of consciousness too, in order to interface it in a way that is unitive and taking us toward the omega point and not just branching off for the sake of being able to do something, right? Oh, I can resurrect the dinosaur. Let's just do that anyway, right? The whole Jurassic Park conundrum. For who, for what, why, how does it serve the omega point, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Did I already mention Taylor's footnote about the lie?
I don't think so, no.
It's a little tiny footnote in one of his essays from 1947, but it's very prescient, I thought. Um, he says that the lie, like lying to each other,
Mhm.
lie in the context of small groups is not too dangerous, but on the level of large assemblages, um, the lie, he said, can prevent the formation of the noosphere.
Mm.
But that was, I mean, that's really speaking to our time.
Yeah. Yeah, especially as people say that we're in like a post-truth age.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, it's very, very interesting. Huh. I'm gonna have to go back and find it. Do you know the essay it's in?
I will send that to you. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Um,
Um, yeah, this is a very interesting time we're in here. It's very divisive, but I think there's so much opportunity for unity too, because amidst all that division, I think people are really trying to sort out what's important to them. And these recurring themes like health, happiness, community start coming up, and that's ubiquitous to any people of any culture. That's not going to be racist in a way, that's not going to be exclusive. And in terms of like our evolution and becoming cyborgs and all that, something I always go back to is just we're so unhealthy. We are so unhealthy in our own bodies as an American public. Our chronic disease rate is so high. Look at the way that our country, our general public responded to the COVID pandemic versus the way that some other countries responded. And so much of that just has to do with our own physical health. How and why would we want to, again, we go into spiritual bypassing, physically bypass that in a way? Wouldn't we want to, in the spirit of Teilhard's ultra human, figure out the healthiest way possible for us to live? And of course, that's not one standard diet or exercise regimen or something. Everybody's body is so different. It's a call to that union differentiating, right? It's like if we were to rally around health, now, of course, this is not what Teilhard says. And he says, actually, it's not going to be one cause that unites us or something like that, but it's rather the sense of being that we desire. But if we were to like rally around health or the planet or something like that, it would seem to be a much more cohesive and unitive effort than some of these hyper specific efforts to tease out difference in a way that, yes, difference needs to be affirmed and included within our world. But when that comes at the expense of putting other people down or driving that division even further, it becomes quite problematic. So it's like now I think we're finally getting to a point where people are starting to say, well, what beyond all of this division is really important here in order to go forward?
and I'm convinced we're still in the dawning of the age of Aquarius myself. Um, and had a thought just a moment ago. Um, I'm thinking of the photo Earthrise during the mid 20th century, well before that photo became available. A leading physicist, whose name I don't remember right now, predicted that once we see our planet from space,
Mm.
everything will be different. And invoking some language from the process philosophy community, they talk about concrescence,
Mhm.
where all, the multiple becomes one, and then the multiple are added by one when that happens, but still it becomes one. And it felt, and it still feels to me, I didn't know the word concrescent 1968 when that picture came out, but it felt to me like that should have sparked some kind of leap of consciousness.
Mm.
I think it did, and it still is. It's just that a change of age happens much more slowly than back then we thought it might.
Right, right. And I've even heard of what is called, I believe, the overlook effect that astronauts will often experience when they go and leave the stratosphere and go into orbit. They look back on the Earth, much like you're talking about Earthrise, and they have a totally paradigm transforming perspective on life.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that should contribute to a mutation.
Right,
Holding
right.
out for.
Right, right. And it's like, yeah, it's like that maybe is the mutation, going inside ourselves, working on the muddier parts to bring some clarity to them, physically working on ourselves, right? Trying to make ourselves healthier, eat healthier, like because we're at such odds where the air we breathe is polluted, the food we eat is toxic, the water we drink has all sorts of chemicals in it. It's like no matter how healthy you try and be, you're still at odds with all these other factors. But therein is that challenge to be through your own pursuit of, trying to become more whole, more integrated, more omega focused, the social action that inspires too, right? It's like we can't just keep these things within ourselves. We have to, like you were saying in your journey in LA at the beginning, find a sense of community that allows us that larger sense of consciousness.
I really like a saying from Bayo Komalafe, which has become pretty popular in the recent couple of years. And he attributes it to his Yoruba people. The times are urgent. We must slow down. And we're, at least in our culture, Western culture in general, we're in such a hurry. And we think we can hurry things, and we can't. And especially we shouldn't.
Right.
Some things, many things have their own seasons. Almost hate to mention it, but I became aware recently of an interview that David Brooks did with one of David Brooks, um, journalist and very, very
Okay.
journalist. He did an interview with a person whose name I don't even want to mention, one of the architects of the extreme right movement. And this person is very sophisticated in how they are recruiting people on the very precinct level, very local levels. And the way he put it was, we're giving them a chance to feel like they're part of something bigger than themselves. And to my dismay, he even invoked Teilhard. And he says, this is like the noosphere.
Interesting.
And to me, that was practically sacrilege, because it invokes noosphere in the service of hating each other and excluding people who are not like us.
Mm-hmm.
And near the end of the human phenomenon, I may have already mentioned this, Teilhard identifies possible outcomes for the ultimate Earth, and he does acknowledge the possibility of a final split between whatever wants to hold everything back and what wants to mutate. That's not his favorite outcome, obviously, but he does acknowledge it. So it still really is up to us individually and collectively to discover what a mutation can be.
Yeah, and I guess, if you really wanted to argue for that being noosphere, there are forces of novelty and there are forces of entropy, right? That are in this flux of how we move forward. And it's maybe like a more unconscious level of noosphere where we're living out of this place of hate and fear and difference rather than a conscious noosphere, which really I think starts to maybe blur the line between noosphere and Christosphere too, because when we really start to be aware of our connection to, first of all, ourself, right? Some people are just so disconnected from themselves. They have no idea who they are, no sense of identity. They just follow the crowd, right? But so our connection with ourself, with the divine, with each other and community, and then especially with the planet, that's really the way forward, as opposed to something that is just always constantly just turning within and circling the wagons, right?
And it is true that being part of a mob gives one a sense of being part of something bigger than oneself. But almost by definition, it's really short-lived,
Right.
and it dissipates, usually after some negative effect.
Right.
The kind of communion we're fantasizing about does not want to be a mob, nor manipulatable in great numbers by somebody standing outside of it and cynically controlling it. We don't want that.
Mhm.
So figuring out what we do want um, is a big challenge.
Yeah. Yeah.
We find it in each other. I think that's the only way we find it. So facing our own shadows individually, um, and then can mean after that or along with
Right.
uh, our collective shadows, plural. Collectivities have shadows.
Yeah, and it's like we may need to revisit our shadow several times in our lifetime, right? It's not just a one-time thing. It's like, oh, I've grown as a person. 10 years later, I think I maybe should take stock of how my shadow has grown too, how it has evolved. Otherwise, it's going to express its autonomous mind on its own when I let my guard down and I'm not as, integrated in my awareness of what's happening. And then all of a sudden, there it is, right? It's, oh my God, where did that come from?
I never get to say, okay, I did that. that's done.
Yeah, always towards the better. So, Ernie, you had quite a journey. I'm really grateful for you sharing your story journey with Teilhard and how you've evolved as a person over this time. So, in your practice with spiritual direction, and you've been through a spiritual journey yourself, being raised Catholic, if you've said you forayed to Buddhism in your earlier life, and then you found yourself coming back to Christianity in the context of Teilhard and his vision. What are, just a lesson or two, maybe, what are some of the more impactful things that you've taken from him that you have found effectual in living out in your own life, in your practice as a spiritual director, in your academic pursuits? What has impacted you most from your journey with Teilhard?
Ongoingly, the longing for communion. And I guess that was already planted in me, but it was especially um, exacerbated by becoming familiar with Teilhard. And the spirit of the earth and the sense of the earth, um, which also leads to a lot of dismay over what we're doing to the earth because we are the earth.
Mm.
The sense of possibility. Remember peripherally a conversation I had with Ron Panakar a long time ago. We were talking about Teilhard, and Panakar said that one reservation he had about Teilhard is that it's too much oriented on the future. That's one of its attractions for us as well. There's this future ahead of us that is still emerging. But Panakar cautioned that a fixation only on the future tends to drain the life out of the present.
Mm.
And it's all there. We see that phraseology used some these days, the not yet God or the God of the future, things like that. All well and good, but we need to stay fully in the present as well. I'm currently not doing individual spiritual direction the way that I did for a while. If I am still doing spiritual direction, and I guess I am in a certain way, because I'm still holding on for mutation, and a core part of what I really hope to contribute to is a deepening of anybody's longing for communion.
Mhm.
And I guess that's a Teilhardian vocation, and in a way, it's a spiritual direction practice.
Right.
I just don't call it that these days.
Well, that's wonderful. Thank you for your service in that way and all that you've done over your storied career in terms of sharing the work of Teilhard and his larger vision with audiences. It's been great to connect with you through the ATA, and I am hearing rave reviews so far of your the human phenomenon book study that you're doing.
I appreciate that.
I haven't been able to join myself, but there's a couple people, one here at the Abbey, one of the Norbertine priests who is a participant, and I have a friend that's a participant. So they just have great things to say so far. Lots of questions are asking me that are inspired by your session. So it's already inspiring great thought. Ernie, anything else you might like to share going forward, or do you have a website that you'd like to share with our audience?
I have a website called pointomega.com, but I haven't done anything to it lately. There's still some old stuff up there, and I intend maybe to return to it. I'm probably going to be starting a Substack.
Great.
Sometimes these are probably more accessible, and maybe stay tuned for some of that. I'll announce that through the Human Phenomenon seminar as well. Mainly, I notice about myself. Um, I sometimes cut off my own hopefulness by my dismay over the planet. And so I need to, because I so much want to foment in other people a longing for transcendence, I have to remind myself to let that be in myself too.
Mm.
Do feel that almost, what Teilhard called that almost sensual longing.
Yeah.
Not even almost, a sensual longing.
Mhm. Yeah, there's something in me that is an itch that is scratched through Teilhard and through Teilhardians that isn't elsewhere,
Yeah,
not within the church, not within any other sphere or circle that I find myself in. It's not as integrated as his thought and his vision. And I think really because it includes our heart. It includes our heart in a way that takes us beyond ourselves, beyond our limits, beyond our capacities. It takes us closer to God. I'm biased in saying that, but it as heady as his thought is, it is just as much centered in his heart, and that is really the key going forward in my mind.
and you get that balance in him by reading his letters as well as his books, especially his letters to friends where he's was celebrating a wedding or something like that. The love actually shows through brightly.
It does. And I've always been appreciative of you, Ernie, in any book study I've been in with you, or even like board meetings. You'll just pull a quote out or anything. And I've always affirmed you as being like a Teilhardian encyclopedia. You just pull out these words and phrases and, paragraphs or whatever from his work with such ease that it's so impressive. And we're just really grateful for the work you've been doing, the work that you're continuing to do with Teilhard, and for your time here today and sharing your story with us, sharing your myth with us.
Right. If I become aware of my myth, then I'm already in another one.
That's right. And we're all discovering the myth that we're all a part of here in terms of our evolution toward Omega, right?
That's right. And we'll find another story without just sitting down and writing it. We will discover another story.
And we've got to live it, right?
Got to live it. That's how we discover it. Yeah.
Well, Ernie, thank you so much for your time today. Very grateful for this opportunity to sit down and chat with you. It's been great to be one-on-one here. And we look forward to your offerings coming up with the ATA, anything else you might be doing with Cobb Institute. And we'll direct people to your website, pointomega.com, to possibly get a lead into your Substack too. So thanks so much, Ernie.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it. Appreciate the time.
Peace.